Burning questions.
Insightful answers.
Listener's choice.
With Clement Manyathela.
On our Listener's Choice feature this morning, we are discussing the different types of taxes that we pay. You'll remember following the postponement of the budget speech due to the disagreements about the 2 percentage point increase in VAT, one of our listeners asked that we look at each and every tax that we pay in South Africa. And of course, some taxes are once off, when you pay your transfer duties, when you're buying property. Some taxes are constant, like VAT or Syntax. So how are these taxes also determined? I mean, we pay a lot of tax directly and indirectly. Direct taxes paid by taxpayers directly to the government, whereas indirect taxes are taxes levied on the supply of goods and services. So we've invited someone who knows more about this than many of us, who's going to guide us through this conversation. So if you've got any question around taxes we pay, give us a call on 011-883-0702. WhatsApps on 0727021702. Professor Keith Engels is the Chief Executive Officer at the South African Institute of Taxation. Prof, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, the listener who asked us to have this conversation, the first question he asked is, why are there so many different taxes that individuals must pay, both direct and indirect?
Yeah, there is a good question to that. Look, you're trying to spread the pain on different points. So what government is trying to do is that some taxes are more effective in one place than others, and each has a balancing act. So, for instance, the value-added tax is a very broad-based tax, but it really applies mainly to the middle and the lower income people. So what happens is that tax falls, even though it falls on everyone, it disproportionately falls the middle on the lower. So you don't want that tax to become too high. Otherwise, it's considered regressive and it hits the bottom and the middle too much. Whereas the personal income tax is more progressive, and that's hitting the upper end more. So sometimes you're trying to distribute this fairly. We all have to pay tax, but it's a question of how much we can afford. And so how we spend and how we act depends on how much we can afford. So in theory, that's what it's about. On the other hand, too, you can look at it as sometimes government wants to hide the pain, not just spread the pain. And so in a lot of places, if you put it in little places here and there, you don't notice it as much.
Do you find that, because this is a debate I normally have also with some friends of mine that are economists, about how that pain is spread? Is it spread disproportionately? Because you've got higher earning South Africans who say, we're being taxed so much. Over 40% of our salaries in personal income tax are going straight to government. And you've got people who are, lower working class people who say, well, in these value-added taxes, we also feel like we're the ones that are heavily being taxed. So is it disproportionate, this pain that is being spread?
So there are two ways. There's so is it, disproportionate? Is somebody bearing an unfair burden? Now you see that most of them, a lot of people are off the system. So a number of people who are not subject to personal income tax are subject to the VAT. Now, so the one thing about the VAT is it is widely spread. The question is how high it is, though. So there comes a point, like a value-added tax is really just a sales tax, and 17% is quite a lot. Maybe not by European standards, but there they have a lot more benefits. But around the world, a sales tax of 17 is a lot. In the United States, when you're getting to 8 or 9% for everything you purchase, that's considered quite a lot. So it's not a question of how sometimes whether it's how it's shared, it's just the total amount. So when you look at the South African tax system overall and you add it all up, everyone is paying a lot based on the amount they have. So it's not about one person being hit more fairly than another. It's we're all taking a lot because we're maintaining a lot. We have a lot of debt and we have a big government.
Yeah, absolutely. It's 12 minutes now after 11 o'clock. You can give us a call if you've got questions for Professor Keith Engels about all these taxes that we pay. The number to dial is 011-883-0702. WhatsApp's on 072-702-1702. Prof, another question that we got a lot is how many taxes do we actually pay? I know you've since we started this conversation, you've mentioned a few of them: personal income tax, value-added tax. What else is there that we pay, whether it's direct or indirect?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, they all add up. The question is, who's we? But, I mean, your basic taxes are personal income tax, value-added tax, and corporate tax. Those are your three main, pickups. You have customs duties on all your imports. That's another one. Then you have a lot of these little excise taxes or ad valorem taxes where it's on beer and wine and sugar and all of these miscellaneous ones. And then there are ones that are really strange, like on tire production, you'll see. So sometimes you don't realize it, but certain forms of manufacturing get hit. Cigarettes. So there's a lot of miscellaneous taxes floating around. Some people would say when you pay a fee to government, when it comes to form, that's a form of tax. So lots of little tiny taxes. And unfortunately, I think there are a little bit too many because it becomes very difficult for the Revenue Service to monitor them all. But the hope is that some of these will pick up money where you don't notice. So you often don't notice where all of these are. But there must be at least 40 or 50 different type of taxes when you add them up. But at the end of the day, the big three are value-added tax, personal tax, and corporate tax, and customs picks up the bigger numbers. And the excise taxes also come in there as well. That's where the big money is.
And government is so reliant. Would you say they're overly reliant on the taxes? And how important also is just whether it's VAT or all these other taxes, that contribution to the fiscus? I was reading an opinion piece by a good mate, Kaya Setole, who wrote an opinion piece this morning on News 24 talking about how the solution to even the budget problem that we have in this country does not lie in taxation, but it lies in growing the economy. And I wonder if what you think of that, because some of our politicians think, what we need to do is just to increase VAT or increase personal income tax, when in fact the focus needs to be so much on growing the economy. That could be our solution, no?
Yeah, it can be. Let's take step one. Every government, the money that it gets is from tax. So all around the world, government is reliant on tax. The United States, the original formation of government, they didn't allow the government to have taxes, but then it just fell apart because government needs to get its money. The only way it can get its money is through tax. That's its revenue stream. Just like a business has a till, that's their revenue stream. So tax is essential part of every good government. The question is, how big do you want your government? So one thing that I've learned over time, and some of the experts told me who've worked in the treasuries in Europe and elsewhere, is that expenditure drives tax. Tax does not drive expenditure. So you have tax in order to raise revenue to do the things you want to do. Now, the more things you want to do, the more tax you're going to have. So the problem here that's been the dispute, the value-added tax is not the issue. The issue is how big do you want government to be? How important do we want government to be involved in everything? And so what you have in the budget there is a decision that we want more government, and therefore you have to fund it. You don't just go taxing and then do something else. And so now the question then is, well, on this big government, do we want to fund this big government? So the real problem first is, are we spending too much? Now, we know we've got big debt, so we're stuck with that, but we spent too much money in the past, right? So when you have credit card debt, that's because you had a fling over the weekend and you shouldn't have spent all that money. But so we've got that problem, but how much money do we spend wanting to go forward? And when you look at this budget, it was very clear that they're raising the VAT because they want to add more expenditure than they already have. And if you look at the government wants to expand its numbers more than GDP growth. So the general growth is like less than 1%, and yet they want to grow a few percentage points by government. They want government to grow faster than the economy, and that's a problem. So you do need to get the growth going. if you want to keep doing this. But the real question is this government too big or too inefficient? Or are we just going to accept that government is fixed and ever rising cost? And that's the real debate. Now, if you believe the people who push forward this budget that we need more government, then the only choice was VAT, because that's the only fast way to get the money. But the question is, do you believe that, or is it time to cut government back? And then again, there is the other point that the best way to get revenue is to grow the economy. That just takes a lot of work, and you need to have policies to grow the economy, and we don't seem to have those.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work, a lot of tough decisions as well. I want to take some calls now, Prof, and some WhatsApp voice notes. We've got some listeners who've got some inputs. We've got questions as well. We'll start with Unati, who is calling us from Centurion. Go ahead, Unati. Good morning. What's your question?
Hi, good morning, Clement. It's more of a statement, but a question at the same time. I think there's an ideological issue here that we're dealing with. One is that the state is responsible for creating an enabling environment for the private sector to invest and operate. Then the state becomes the beneficiary from the taxes that it collects based on the efficiencies and whatever that it takes the private sector. But the issue that I have is that if we were to have the state controlling the mines, if we were to have the state, we don't have a private sector that is as prominent as we have in this country, where the ownership or the means of production is controlled by the state, would not necessarily be increasing more taxes. Because if, for instance, you look at the biggest employer in this country is government. And if you look at also in terms of, if you were to now say, as the Prof has just indicated, to say that the state maybe is too big. If you were to trim the state, where would those people be employed? What other problems will you be creating? Because I feel like even in the mining sector, when there's a problem with the mine or what's called this tremors and everything else, it becomes a problem of the state to actually make sure that it actually moves people from this place to the other place. But the person that actually benefited from the mining the resources under that place is nowhere to be seen, and they are not responsible. So we've created a burden against the state, but the state is not controlling any assets that are actually generating revenue. But if we had to have, even the hospitals that we have, the state has to compete with the private sector. And only way of actually getting money from the private sector is through taxation. And now you ended up having a state that is begging to actually make sure that it is responsible to its citizens. Thank you.
Got it. Unati, thank you so much for that. I'll get Professor Engels to respond to that in a moment. Cynthia, what's your question? Good morning. You're calling from
Thanks, Clement,
Kemptonville.
for always educating us. I just want to know, I heard that we owe, or the government owes, or the people owe SARS so many millions. And if the government were just to help SARS collect those millions, we would not have a deficit. I think I read it somewhere, I can't remember where, I'm a very old person, but I read it somewhere now lately, in the last week or a week, that if we help SARS collect what is owed to them, I think they maybe have, their systems are not working properly, but if we just help them, we will not have a deficit and the country will be okay and just continue paying the debt. Can I listen on the radio?
Yeah, listen, that's it. Yes, listen on the radio, Cynthia. That's a good question. In fact, the SARS commissioner, Edward Kisveta, is the one who said it. Instead of looking at VAT increases and why don't you capacitate SARS so that it becomes more and more efficient, you modernize it, and then you improve your tax collection. That's where you're going to get all of this money you need in a deficit. Prof, you can respond to those two statements and questions.
I think those are very valid questions. Look, I think one of the things we get into an argument, because Unani raises it, is that we're not talking about zero government and zero private sector. So when people argue, they want a libertarian state where the government doesn't exist and, the private sector does everything. And then there's the other one where government's going to do everything. Now, the problem is you need a balance between government and the private sector. And the question is, what's the relevant part? Now, government doesn't own, government effectively, technically has taken control of the mining rights. But there are different ways to get money on mining. You don't have to own the mine in order to get revenue. Question, is it better for government to run the mines, or is it for the private sector to run the mines with government getting a percentage? And government does get a percentage through taxes, the income tax on corporates, and it also gets it through a royalty. Now, if you run it directly, will you get more of the profits? Well, it depends how efficient you are. So there's a debate of how big you want government to be. And one of the issues, too, is if you want government to be smaller, it employs a lot. Do you want government to be an employment agency? So how much do you want the government to do it? The problem is that government is not really good at raising revenue outside of taxation. So if you want government to run everything, you're talking about a communist state, and that just doesn't work because governments are not very good at that. But that doesn't mean that there should be no government. So the question is not so much is it no or all, it's what balance do you want government versus the private sector? And if the government becomes too big, the private sector can't generate enough revenue for the government. So you've got to give the private sector enough freedom that you do tax them and do take a portion of what it's being earned. So that's the big balance that's going on here. And that's where the big debate is. Now, the second issue that was raised is what they call is the tax gap. So we have a lot of laws and we hope to make a lot of money, but we make some, but not as much as we would hope. So, for example, government said they're going to make $60 billion on this VAT increase, but a lot of people say, well, in theory you will, but you're probably only going to collect maybe 45 or 50 out of the 60. And that's because of a lack of enforcement. Now, over the last number of years, we've spent a lot of money and we've put a lot of effort into SARS. So it's not like SARS is not collecting anything. They are collecting quite a bit, and they're much stronger than they ever were. I think the commissioner's done a very good job. But there is always a gap. And where is that gap? And so, because if those people who should be paying are not paying, it's not fair to the rest of us. And if they don't pay, then for us to pay more in the VAT is unfair, or any other tax. So where's the gap? Well, one, we have a large informal sector that the only tax we get is the value-added tax. And some would say we should be getting more out of that informal sector. Maybe we should, but I would argue that there's only so much to be taken there, and we better keep it simple and keep it small. Another area that we have is we have corruption. We have a lot of tenderpreneurs, and we have a lot of people who are soaking off the state, and they're not only stealing, but they're not paying their fair share of tax either. So there's a good chunk of money there. There's some people with avoidance. There are people who undeclare. So if you want to get more money, what the commissioner wants to do is he wants to improve his data verification. He says, look, we can do a lot, but a system that's based on honesty and self-declaration doesn't work. We need to be able to have enough information reporting that if you say this is how much money you made, that there's some sort of system that says, yes, that's true or not. And so you need access to the banks, you need access to other parts of government. So I agree with Kieswetter, that may be a good way of picking up more money. Now, if you do want to pick up more money, the problem is if you give the money to the commissioner, it's going to take about 2 years to get going. And in this budget, they wanted the money immediately. So I think there's definitely a case for putting more in there. But again, there's also a question, ultimately, is how do we spend this money? Are we happy with how this money is being spent? So a lot of people are angry, saying, look, you already have enough money, government. You're not efficient with it. There's a lot of waste and patronage. And I don't care what the cause is now. We don't believe you, and you shouldn't get any more.
Yeah, that's why people often say we don't have a revenue problem. We've got a spending problem. I've got 2 more questions for you, Prof. Let's start with the WhatsApp voice note.
Hi, Clement. Morning's Veronica here. Just ask the Prof, why are we paying tax on our bonuses? I mean, that's extra work we gave our employer. But now the government taxes us for performance. So really, I feel it's unfair. I know I've retired, but really, I used to get very upset when my thing gets taxed, the bonus. That's Veronica from Sprague View. Bye-bye.
Hi, Clement. I've always wondered, what is this property tax all about? If you buy a piece of land and you haven't built on that land, there's a tax that you pay. And then once you build, it kind of falls away. What is that all about?
Hi, Clement. Great show. I have a question for the Prof. How are the upper echelon tax in terms of like the politicians and things? Because as far as I know, they also don't pay like for electricity and water and things like that. How are they taxed on in their income bracket, and how does decreasing expenditure in terms of the perks for politicians and government in general, travel expenses and that, how might decreasing the expenditure of that help in the recovery of revenue and the kind of easing of the tax burden on middle to lower income people?
All right, thank you so much for your questions, Prof.
Okay, let's take one at a time there. I think there was one about the bonuses. I think the issue is the way the income tax works is it's based on how much money you earn or receive. So the technical answer is that whenever you make money, bonuses or otherwise, it's all income. It's added in. Your bonus is like your salary. It doesn't matter. The fact that you did something great, government doesn't care. It takes income from all sources, like the value-added tax. It doesn't matter how much you spend the money. Pretty much everything is subject to the value-added tax. So it's a very theoretical tax, but unfortunately, sometimes people don't think it's fair. So like many people don't like the issue of paying tax on tips. They go, look, I hardly make enough money, and now you're going to tax me on the tip? These are little things that you should ignore. So a lot of benefit is things are like fringe benefits. Should we be taxed on the fringe benefits? So in theory, you should be taxed on everything. Now, there's sort of a common understanding that you should let some stuff go. But if you start letting stuff go, then you start weakening your tax base. So it doesn't always work that way. Fringe benefits are a big problem. So you can see that government workers, they will... the parliament and otherwise, they get little fringe benefits, and some of those benefits are free. And those shouldn't be free. So there's something called the Mandela rule, that Mandela, and this does exist, that if the minister earns salary and the president earns salary, they are all taxed. At one time, the president used to be exempt. They said, if you're going to make rules, then you need to live by the rules. So all government people should be taxed by the same rules. And there are some benefits in tax where there are fringe benefits that governments get that they're not taxed on. But I think the real issue is whether they should be getting the fringe benefits. So the issue is, why should every minister get a car? Really? I mean, you might say the president needs it, but when it comes to security, they're not in danger. They don't really need a special car. They're not that important. Do they need a special house? Do all of these little benefits, forget the tax, should they be getting these fringe benefits at all? And so then that becomes an issue of, well, again, it comes down to an expenditure. I don't mind raising taxes, but I don't want to pay for that. Unfortunately, even if we got rid of all the fringe benefits and we knocked out all of those little things we talked about, that would not solve our deficit problem. Our deficit problem is much bigger than that. And the difficulty that we have is it's much more with the tenderpreneurs and the waste and mid-level management and all of that that's there that we don't necessarily need. So that may help, and I think it helps as a matter of fairness. So again, it's a question of balance in all of this. And the problem when you're talking about income tax is that a lot of us are just not making enough money to live on. And so when you're looking at taxes, for example, do you really want to tax the spaza shop? They don't make enough money. There's a point where you're poor and it's just too much to add the personal tax. And so a lot of the problems that we have is we have brackets, not just at the 45% rate, but the 18% rate, and they're kicking in too low. We need a higher exemption threshold just to live on. And that way, that would be fairer at the bottom level. And then there's one more question on property. You want me to answer that?
Oh, yeah. Quickly, if you can, in 20 seconds,
property tax, if you own property, you pay tax. There shouldn't be an exemption. If you own vacant land, it's a lot less. Once you build on it, it's more. All property is subject to tax on municipal rates. But the municipal rates in this country, it's not that high. but still owning property is being taxed, and that becomes very unaffordable because you want to be, the purpose of owning a house is knowing that you're not paying rent, and if you're going to pay tax instead, it doesn't really make much sense. But property tax is a common way of raising revenue.
Prof, thank you so much. You have been absolutely amazing in helping us understand this. In fact, I think we should actually do a feature or a series, maybe call it Economics 101, and maybe we can have you, Prof, join us to answer some more questions from some of our listeners. Professor Keith Engels is the Chief Executive Officer at the South African Institute of Taxation.